Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I won't be monitoring the chat for any questions, but if you have anything urgent to ask me, you can just interrupt me and we can chat about it in the middle of the talk. If not, we can just leave them all to the end, and you can write them in the chat so you don't forget about it. And we'll go through the chat later on. So as Marco says, I am now currently at the Missouri Botanical Garden, but I did my postdoc at the Smithsonian, and I'm a research associate at the National Museum of Natural History, and I'm still a research associate there. And I go there, I visit there frequently, both working with my Anthuriums and the other plants, the other plant group that I work with, which are the Heliconias. So super showy, really ornamental plants that probably all of you have seen or have in your houses. So today I'm going to focus on a fairly recent project that I started just before the whole pandemic blew up. I got some funding for a seed project to understand the floral scents of Anthuriums, if they really occur in nature or not. And as soon as we started the collection, we were like a month and a half into the collection, and we had to stop everything. So right now we have really good, exciting results, but we haven't been able to analyze everything. So I just want to give you an overview of how this whole project started, what we were able to accomplish, and where are we going to go in the future. So it's kind of like a three-part project. If you cannot hear me, just let me know so I can turn on the microphones and the volumes. So for most of you, Anthurium is this beautiful red flower that we have here. And there we go. So in reality, Anthurium is a huge genus of aroids, the Araceae family, and it's mostly very highly valued as an ornamental houseplant because of the leaf shapes, like have tons of different colors, venations, shapes, anything that you want. And so far, they're fairly easy to grow. There are in total about 1,500 to 1,000 neotropical species that are distributed all the way from southern Mexico down to northern Argentina. And only there, that's the only place where Anthurium occurs, even though you might find them in your house in other places. There is also a huge market for Anthurium cut flowers. And here in the US, the market is centered in Hawaii, in the family growers of Hawaiian Anthuriums. So I was able to visit Hawaii in 2016 and 17, and I was able to visit the growers and the growing operations in Hawaii, which have been around for several decades and are still the most important flower export of the island. And Hawaiian growers of Anthuriums are among the top 3 locations of areas where you can acquire Anthuriums in the general global market. So of course you can see that these cut flowers are just beautiful. You can find it in a lot of different colors, shapes, and everything. So it's a really well established and really important commercially industry. The growing of Anthuriums in Hawaii is still restricted to local farms and family-owned businesses. They were brought into Hawaii from England in about the 1800s, the late 1800s. And the industry itself have gone to like peaks when a lot of Anthuriums were sold and millions of dollars came into Hawaii and to Hawaiian growers for these plants, downs when we get diseases. And a lot of the local populations die off because they are basically clones of each other and they may not have the resistance to whatever bacteria, a worm, pathogen, etc. comes in. Right now, it's stable, but they're still producing a lot of flowers. And there is still a big source of income from Hawaiian growers in there. Is also, even though Anthurium does not occur natively in Hawaii, it's only grown in greenhouses and nursery, right? It does not make it to Hawaii. It's from Mexico to Argentina, right? It's still very ingrained in the Hawaiian culture. I don't know if if Hawaiians realize that Anthurium is not a native flower, but they use it in all their native cultural offerings, including the offerings to the goddess Pele, which is the volcano goddess in the Kilauea crater. So this is a picture that I took in one of my trail hikes that I did over there. So it was really interesting to me to see how a plant that is not even part of their native ecosystem is so highly valuable for Hawaiians. The other thing is that this Anthurium is not only valuable for Hawaiians, it's also valuable for like an entire industry. So if you go to Home Depot, you will find Anthuriums and you can take them home and take them to your office. I actually have one in my office right now. It's not doing very good, but I have it there. So you can have them in your house, you can have them in your office. You can also find a lot more varieties if you find a local tropical nursery nearby. And of course, they're used a lot in weddings and banquets and floral arrangement because they're very showy flowers with a lot of beautiful colors. So when I was visiting Hawaii, I was talking to the growers and they say like, yes, our industry is very good. We're getting a lot of profit from it. But sometimes we encounter customers that decide not to buy our Anthuriums because of a simple reason. They do not know when they see these flowers if they're real or fake. So if we go back to these pictures in here, you can see that all those flowers to the naked eye, to the untrained eye, they look like plastic, right? And the people that are deciding if they want to buy them or not, they look at them and say, okay, they look like plastic and they do not smell. So have you ever smelled an Anthurium? I have, like I did when I was there in Hawaii, and totally, they do not smell. So the customer is saying, these are flowers that look very pretty, but I cannot give them to somebody because they're gonna say it's a fake flower, it's a plastic flower. So that's like a real problem for the industry of Anthurium, right? I'm trying to sell this commodity and people think I have something that is not real. So I went back and I smelled every single one of the things that I could find available everywhere. So at Home Depot, I smell all the Anthuriums. They do not smell. I did go to a tropical nursery in Florida and they have tons of Anthuriums. They do not smell. The ones they sell, they do not smell. I did go to a wedding in Hawaii that the bride had an Anthurium bouquet. Beautiful, beautiful flowers. They did not smell. Of course, the one that I have in my office, I smell it every day, try to find a smell, they do not smell. And flower arrangements that I find everywhere in hotels, right? They do not smell. So are these plants actually fake or they're real? Or what's going on in here? So out of all these pictures in here, just by a show of hands, I might not be able to see everybody, but which one of these do you think is the fake one? There is actually a fake Anthurium in here. Which one is it? You can unmute yourself.
Number 3.
Number 3. John, over there, I saw a 5. Between 3 and 5. Are we good?
4.
And number 4. Okay. So actually, the only fake Anthurium in here is number 5. All the other ones are real Anthuriums that do not smell. I definitely look like plastic. So we have a problem in the Anthurium industry that maybe with science, we can start to solve or start to help out at least, right? So we know in general that plants use the scents of the flowers to attract their pollinators in the wild. Right? This is like you smell a rose and a pollinator is going to come. You smell a daisy, you smell the orchid, and pollinators are going to come. So why are these weird Anthuriums not smelling? Like, what are they doing to attract their pollinators? Because they have to be pollinated, right? They're not wind pollinated, we know that. They have to attract somehow some sort of pollinator in the wild. So we have no idea what they're using. Are they using scents? How? They do not smell. So we do know a little bit about the pollinators of Anturia. And the pollinators themselves are mostly bees. If we make a correlation between like the bees that pollinate orchids are usually attracted by scents. And sometimes we find these same bees in the Anthuriums. So just by common reasoning, there has to be some sort of a scent also in the Anthurium flowers that is attracting these bees, right? So we set up to start finding what research has been done in aeroid pollination in general and in Anthurium pollination in particular. So for the entire family, for the aeroids, is actually the second most studied families in terms of pollination, which is amazing to me because like basically we know very little about Anthurium, but other plants in the aeroid family get really, really well studied. One of those plants is actually very common in your area, right? Eastern US, all the way down to like the Carolinas, all the way up to Virginia, Maryland. I think it goes all the way up to Vermont even. We have the Symplocarpophoridus, which is commonly known as a scone cabbage. So in this plant, both the leaves and the flowers smell. And when the chemistry of the flowers is studied, there are about 28 main compounds that are released when the flower is heating up and ready to be pollinated. And out of those, about 8 have compounds that have sulfur in it. And that's what gives these really bad smells to these flowers. So kind of a combination of onion with potato, with garlic, with a little bit of poop. So not a very pleasant smell for sure, but it definitely has a function. The function is attract the pollinators, and the pollinators are mainly beetles and sometimes flies. So it makes sense that these kind of animals are attracted to these kind of like rotting flesh smells. So the other group that has been really well studied in aeroids is the infamous quartz flower. So, or Amorphophallus titanum, which we have had in bloom here at the garden every single year since 2006, I believe. And you guys have it up there at the US Botanical Garden, and it's been flowering pretty frequently too. When I was there last time, about 3 years ago, it was actually flowering. So it was really nice. It's really nice to see that you can experience the smell in person, even in places where these plants don't grow. So the Amorphophallus is originally endemic to Sumatra, but it's being like widespread in botanical gardens. And you can always go smell it whenever they open, because it's like, and it's like a show, like the people actually make it there at midnight. I have done that to smell the flower, because they only open at night during the very late hours of the night. So to me, it's really not a bad smell. I will compare it more to the smell of cooking Brussels sprouts. But to other people, it smells a little bit bad. And since today is Dia de los Muertos, this would be like the perfect plant to have in one of the offerings of the Dia de los Muertos altars for sure. So channeling my inner Latin heritage, I will definitely do some kind of offering to the quartz flower today in Dia de los Muertos. So it seems like for aeroids, for the entire family, the plants that have been studied are the ones that stink really bad, that they have a very obvious smell. So we know that most of these smells come from the sulfur-containing compounds. Actually, the one here in the middle, the dimethyl disulfide, that is exactly the same compound that is found in the Brussels sprouts. So to my nose, that is the main compound that I'm smelling, even though there are other things that can also make it into there. So why are we so just fascinated about this smelly thing, bad smelly things? We have neglected completely Anthuriums. Like there were, when we started this project, there were 2 papers on the floral scents of Anthurium. That's it. Like nowadays we have a lot more techniques, I guess, and we can start figuring out what the smells of these plants are, if they even have one. So that's where all our questions came. The first question, the most basic one, is, do Anthuriums inflorescences smell? And what is the most obvious way to do that? Start sniffing all the flowers that we can find. So me, my interns, and my collaborator have spent a lot of time smelling every single inflorescence of Anthurium that we find in the greenhouses and in the wild. The second thing that we want to figure out is, if they do smell, what do they smell like? Do they smell good? Do they smell bad? They don't smell at all? They don't smell to our noses, but they might smell to an insect nose, insect receptors. That might also be a tricky question to answer. And of course, what are the actual chemicals that are behind these smells? The perfume industry have figured out a lot of the chemicals already, and they have been able to synthesize them for us. So we can figure out this particular flower of Anthurium has the smells of these and these in these other chemical compound that we know of. Now, other questions that pop up is if there are any patterns in the floral scent. So does every single species of Anthurium smells different? Or are there certain groupings of things that we can figure out for the flowers of Anthurium? So, of course, the easiest way to answer all of these questions is to have a huge collection of these plants alive. And we do have it here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. For the entire family, we have about 3,500 individual little plants, accessions throughout the greenhouses and the conservatories of the garden. And about 1,500 of those are actually Anthurium plants. We have about 600 species of Anthurium, so we sometimes have duplicate specimens of these plants. So that means that anytime that I go into a greenhouse, I definitely find one thing that is in flowering and is releasing a smell, if it does have a smell. So it's a very unique opportunity to do some very simple research that we haven't been able to do in the past. So how do we do this? Is basically we put a vacuum, like the same that we use in our floors and carpets, to suck out all the scents that the inflorescences are producing. So we go around the greenhouses, start smelling everything whenever we go there. And if we find something that to our noses smell, then we decide to collect, right? So there are three basic components to this setup. And the whole system can be seen here on your left-hand side, right? It's a bunch of hoses connected to a very intriguing chamber over here. And of course, you have the inflorescence back in here. So the three more important pieces are the vacuum pump. That's the one that is gonna suck out all the air that is sealed inside this bag. So this is a plastic bag that has no odor at all. So we don't incorporate any artificial plastic smells into our sample, right? And in this, where is my mouse? Right here. In this little tube, that is a glass tube that has a mesh of carbon and fiber that can trap all the chemicals. That is where all the chemicals are going to be stored after we suck them out with the hose. So we leave that bag in there for about 5 minutes. It's a super easy and fast way of sampling, and we can get like all the smells that this inflorescence is producing at that time. We also are interested in when the smells are produced. So we record the time that we did the sampling. We usually, if there is available, we are able to record or collect samples from several individuals of the same species. So we are in a greenhouse space. So some of the natural conditions might not be there, and we want to know if there is individual variation in the smells of the flowers. The other thing that we also try to compare is the phases of the inflorescence. So in terms of Anthurium, each Anthurium flower has both male and female parts all together, but they do not mature or are reproductively ready at the same time. the female parts of the flowers in the whole inflorescence mature and are receptive first. And then when that phase dies off, the male part, the male phase of the inflorescence starts popping up. So we are sometimes able to collect the samples of the scents from both the female and the male phase of the same individual, which is something like really interesting for comparisons later on. So far, we have been able to sample in a month and a half of collecting, going to the greenhouses about 3 times a week. We have been able to collect at different times of the day. We have been able to collect 90 different species of Anthurium in flower, releasing scents. And we have been able to analyze all those samples. And we're now trying to make sense of what is in those samples and how can we group them? How is the diversity of the smells of the floral bouquet of Anthurium? Right? So I'm going to give you a few of our preliminary samples. It's basically divided in 2 groups. Anthurium inflorescences have very good scents that we recognize really easily, like the scent of jasmine, the scent of roses. In terms of fruits, we have a smell blueberries, lemons, or something citrusy, mangoes and bananas. In terms of spices, we have been able to recognize cloves, cinnamon, mint, and some more elaborate smells for sure, like chocolate, baby powder, which is very interesting because to our mind, baby powder is like it's a human-made scent, right? It should not come from a flower, but it does resemble that to our noses. Chewing gum, which is actually a very interesting one. That one I smelled the first time in Hawaii. And they told me, we have an Anthurium that smells like chewing gum. I'm like, no, that can't be possible. And we actually went and it was a flower, it was smelling, and it's like that pink chewing gum that reminds you of like your childhood. Exactly that smell. We have also found other complicated smells, like a smell of marzipan, which is kind of like a baked good smell. And definitely there is one species that smells like pine sol. Like if you're cleaning your floors, and that's exactly the smell that hits you right there. And it's super strong, by the way. So these are the very good scents that we have found in Anthurium in the collections that we have here in the greenhouses at the Missouri Botanical Garden. On the other hand, we have also found really bad scents. So one that is super common is fermenting. The inflorescence is not rotting. The inflorescence is very much receptive. It has pollen shedding. There is no damage to the inflorescence at all, but it smells like it's 2 kinds of fermentation. So we have 2 separate things that smell fermenting. The fermenting of like alcohol, which is more like a yeast kind of fermenting smell, and the fermenting of fruits, which is kind of like a sweet fermenting smell. We have been able to distinguish those 2 smells in different collections that we have. The smell of garlic, once again, it pops up. The smell of compost in a very sunny, nice summer day when all these gases are like being released, that is definitely there. The smell of a wet dog, that was very interesting to find because we associate that with animals, right? Not with plants. And the smell of stinky shoes, which is kind of related to the smell of sweat, right? And a little bit with the smell of feces, poop. And some very strange chemically smells, like the smell of glue, right? That's a very distinct smell also from our childhood. And the smell of leather. So bear in mind that when we go collecting, we cannot shower the day of the collection. We cannot use any perfumes or lotions or deodorants or any shampoos, anything that has a strong smell. We cannot wear clothes that are made of anything that is strong smelling, like leather, for example. So we ourselves are trying to be to get rid of all the smells that we could incorporate into the samples. So when I'm saying sweaty shoes, sweat, leather, these are actually coming from the plant. They are not coming from any of us collecting in the greenhouses. We also have, just to make sure, a blank that we take around the greenhouse space, around the air around the greenhouses. So in case one of us forgot and I did put perfume on that morning, we can catch that in the blank, right? And if it shows up in the other samples that we collected that day, then we can rule it out. It's not actually part of the flowers, it's part of our perfumes, our bodies. So we have been able to isolate both these good smells and these bad smells from Anthurium flowers. So for some of them, the chemicals behind them are super easy to understand. Like the smell of jasmine is mainly one compound and it's a jasmine compound. The smell of clover is an alkaloid, is eugenol. The smell of mint is either xenol or eucalyptol. They're both like interchangeable. The smell of mango is a terpene, is myrcene. And interestingly enough, we find a lot of indoles in our samples. Indoles occur in feces and poop, but at very low concentrations, which we think are the concentrations that are happening in flowers, because flowers are very tiny, and the flowers in Anthurium are very tiny. It actually is a sweet flowery smell. And a lot of perfumes, really high-end perfumes, use this indole in their compositions. So it's very interesting to see how even the proportion of one compound can make it smell super, super nice or very, very bad. Indoles are apparently also found in the coarse flower, but at a very higher concentration. So in the coarse flower, it's kind of giving it the feces smell. In the Anthuriums, it's such a low concentration that is actually giving it a nice, pleasant floral smells. Of course, there are a lot of compounds that we haven't been able to identify. I think the last count was like 283 compounds that are present in a significant proportion in our sample of 90 species. We just have to get more of the chemistry behind them. Like we should be able to figure out at least what the basic chemical composition of these compounds are because of their molecular weight. So hopefully we will be able to identify most of them, if not all of them. For sure, just like we have new species of Anthuriums popping up every single week, we will have some unknown chemical compounds that might be new compounds for floral scents. We might be able to publish those as well, just like we publish new species of Anthurium. So it's an interesting realm of discovery of chemistry in floral scents. So besides the smells and the chemistry behind it, what other things have we been able to see? So one that ended up being super obvious was that if we sample a colorful inflorescence, and by colorful I mean the range of yellows and reds and oranges, those tend to smell the good way, the good scents, the flowery, the fruity, the spicy smells. On the other hand, when we have inflorescences that are kind of dull looking in the gray, green, and purplish black colors, those tend to be the ones that are what we call bad scents, right? They tend to be the fermenting scents, the scents that are very unpleasant to the nose. And back in 1976, there was an Anthurium researcher that was working with diversification on Anthurium, and he actually postulated that there has to be a switch in pollination systems that led to this immense diversity of Anthuriums that we see nowadays. The lineages that are towards, like the earlier divergent lineages in Anthurium, they tend to have very low species diversity, whereas the more recently diverged groups, they tend to have a lot of species. And he associated that with, there's gotta be some change in pollination. And we might be able to see other morphological characters like colors of inflorescences or smells of the inflorescences associated with this change in pollinations systems and in pollinators in general. The other patterns that we were looking at were really interesting. So the good scents were mainly released during the morning hours. And in certain species, it was like clockwork. If you were there between 9 and 11, you will smell it and it was really nice. Be there at 11:30 or noon, it's gone, like it's not there at all. The bad scents, on the other hand, they had two different patterns. Some of them started in the morning and kind of linger all the way into the afternoon. And other ones just started in the afternoon around 4 or 5, like kind of evening time. In our mind, obviously these releases at different time are somehow correlated with the pollinators that they are attracting. The insects that are attracted to the bad smells, they might be more active during the night hours. The insects that are attracted to the good smells are more active during the morning hours. And in general, we know that insects like bees, they tend to be more active during the day when it's warm than during the night when it's kind of cold and they cannot actually fly as well. So it might make sense to have this spread in the timing of the release of the fragrance. You don't want to release a fragrance if the pollinator is not active at that time. The other thing that we compare was the female versus the male phase of the scents. So the way that we know the inflorescence is in a female phase is because it has these droplets in here on the stigma. That means the stigma is receptive for pollen. It's what we call wet stigmas. And actually these droplets, we have measured them and they have up to 12% sugar content. We have no idea what sugars are in there. There is no nectar. They are not nectariferous gland in Anthurium at all. These are secretions coming from the stigmas of the flowers. So this is the female phase. Then when all these droplets dry out, the male phase comes in, and that's when you can actually see the shedding of the pollen. So we were able to sample sometimes the same species, the same individual in both phases, and we figured out they have exactly the same compounds of the floral bouquet, but it's definitely stronger in quantity and in smell to our nose in the male phase. So one thing that we're thinking about that is happening in here is like, okay, during the male phase, you need to like show that you are receptive, that you're shedding pollen with a higher signal, with a stronger signal, because there isn't a lot of reward. The reward is a little bit of pollen that is coming out of the inflorescence. So to attract a pollinator, you have to say, okay, look at me, look at me, look at me, I'm smelling really good. When you are seeing a female phase, the pollinators will actually come to those droplets, and the sugar in those droplets will be another form of reward for pollinators. So you don't really have to smell that much, advertise that much, if you have a secondary reward for the pollinators to come in. The other thing is the smell in the female flower might be trapped in those droplets and might not be able to evaporate as easy. That's something that we haven't been able to test, but it would be really interesting to figure out what happens if you dry out the whole female phase aesthetics and test what is the smell, if there is a stronger smell without the wetness in the stigmas. So since we're still discovering that, like, basically nobody had thought about it, nobody had looked at before, and we're trying to figure out what's going on and figure out how this project will shape up in the future. So talking about that, let's look at the next steps for this project. So I talk a little bit about the difference on the phylogenetic component, on the evolutionary history of these compounds. So far we think that closely related species actually share a very similar floral bouquet. Closely related species do not tend to appear in the same area geographically. So it kind of makes sense that they have the same smell because they won't be competing for pollinators. They are not actually in the same local area, right? But we can also see that some of the floral bouquets have evolved independently in several lineages. So here we have some lineages with this floral bouquet that might have appeared again a second time over here. We are still not 100% sure that it's exactly the same floral bouquet in terms of proportions, in terms of compounds. So we still have to do a little bit more work on that. But we think it's a good chance that are very similar bouquets, at least, that have evolved several times throughout the phylogeny. And there is definitely a division between the earlier divergent lineages and their bouquet and the later divergent lineages and their bouquet. At the same time that we collected the floral scent samples, we were also collecting herbarium vouchers and leaf tissue in silica gel for DNA analysis. We went to the lab and we analyzed all those samples, all those 90 species that we got. We're actually doing genomics to figure out the phylogeny of all these species that we had sampled and how they fall into the bigger picture of the Anthurium phylogeny as well. So that's something that we're still working on actively for sure. And I think the very interesting patterns are gonna come out of the evolutionary history of these floral scents that we're catching right now. So the other thing that we have not touched at all, and basically because of the constraint of working in a greenhouse, is that we don't have the pollinators of these plants on hand. So our second part of the project is actually going to the field and trap the pollinators that these Anthurium species are attracting. Right? So we need to figure out what bees, what beetles, what kind of them, like if it's the same species for all the same Anthuriums that smell the same, is it a different species? It seems like, in general, the type of bees that are being attracted to the good smelling Anthuriums are the same kind of bees that are attracted to orchids. And in orchids, we know that there is a pretty good one-to-one match. One species of bee visits one species of orchid. So we tend to think this is going to be the pattern in Anthurium, but we're not sure. Like Anthurium inflorescences are very open, right? There is no constraining chambers of anything to trap the insects. So basically any insect can go in there and pick up smells and pick up something. So one really interesting, oh, wait, hold on. Okay, go back, one more, there we go. So one interesting result that came out of my collaborators, a study in Costa Rica, was that this little being here, Paratetrapedia chocensis, is actually an oil collecting bee. Only the males visit inflorescences, and these particular males were visiting Anthurium inflorescences of a species that occurs only in Costa Rica and Panama. And they were having exactly the same behavior that they would have in any other flower that they were collecting. They were rubbing the little abdomen into this little padding here that looks like a brush. They were rubbing it right there into the flowers of the inflorescence of Anthurium. These bees particularly, they use these chemicals that trap them in their limbs, and they use them to create their own perfume to attract females. So, and it has been shown that the more diverse the bouquet of the bees, the more possibilities of mating with different females they have. So it's a really interesting, very novel interaction that we had not seen before in Anthurium, and came out of this study of trying to figure out the floral scents of Anthuriums and which are the pollinators that are attracted to these scents. So for sure, a lot of new things to discover in Anthurium as usual. Like it's just a perfect group of plants to work with. I have work until I die if I keep asking questions. So going back to the original idea, how this whole thing started, was these plastic-looking plants, right, that don't smell. So the next step would be, is it possible to actually hybridize the nice smelling one, right, the ones that smells a little flower, hybridize it with a commercially available plant, and actually transfer those smells into the ones that we sell at Home Depot, so people actually think these things are real. So these have actually been done 3 times by the University of Hawaii, by the research group on Anthuriums there, and it has been pretty successful. So the smell was actually transferred to the F1 generation, to the first cross of the generation, in a smaller proportion than the original parent, that was a smelly and sweet smelly parent. But also some of the disease resistance qualities that the commercially available plants had were lost when they were bred with the native populations of Anturia, or the native species of Anturia. So it's always a trade-off, right? You get something good, you may lose something. So we definitely have a lot of open time and open questions to do if we are actually trying to do this hybridization. So far, at least for the Hawaiian industry, all the hybridization between wild populations and commercial populations is done by hand, doing F1 crosses, F2 crosses, trying to maintain the lines as stable as they can. This is not a very huge enterprise. They can last for 10, 15 years before you actually have a stable cross with all the qualities that you have. But if we're able to at least supply them with a list of good smelling Anthuriums, that will make the research so much easier. Also, we can supply them with a list of which one are the plants that are related to each other are more likely to yield a good cross, right? Because if you are crossing an Anthurium from 2 different groups way far apart in the phylogeny, they're not really going to hybridize very well. They're not going to have progeny. They're not going to set fruit. They're not going to do anything. If you cross 2 things that are closer to each other based on their phylogeny, based on their evolutionary history, and then you will be more successful at these hybridization attempts. So our goal is to help out the industry of Anthurium growers in Hawaii by providing the scientific basis of everything that they want or they need. Of course, it would be really easy, or really nice to actually understand the chemical pathways of these compounds. I have here the chemical pathway of the indole, and you can see it has a bunch of different changes and a bunch of other different, maybe non-stable compounds. So if we understand these chemical pathways and probably the genes that are operating in each one of the steps, then we might not need to go to the old school hybridization techniques. We might be able just to choose these genes that are involved in the production of indole at a very low level, so it smells nice, and transfer that gene from the genome of a nice smelling plant to the genome of a commercially available plant, probably in a few years instead of 15 years. We are not quite there yet. There might be other companies that produce Anthuriums that might be farther along. And it would be super easy. It's super nice if we can actually collaborate with them and transfer some of that knowledge into the family operations that we have here in the US. So a lot of different pathways, a lot of different collaborations, and a lot of different ideas that are coming out of this project for sure. So I just want to recap everything that I say and we have found so far, and answering all the questions that we had at the beginning of the talk. So yes, Anthurium species in the wild, not the commercially available ones, the ones in the wild, they do have inflorescence that smell. And smell like a lot of different things. We have 1,500 different species of Anthuriums. We probably will have about 800 different smells, probably 1,500 different compositions of the floral bouquet. They're pretty amazing. Like Anthurium is a very, very diverse genus of monocots, right? It's like they went crazy in my mind. The other thing is that there seems to have phylogenetic component. So that's pretty good in terms of extrapolating results. Those floral compounds seem to be released at specific times. That will help us in the field. So we're not blindly going at any time of the day in the field to collect these plants. We know about when we need to find them. There are also correlations between the floral sense and other floral characteristics, which is also can help us extrapolate certain things if we're not able to find them and to sample them. There seem to be a species-specific floral scent, but not phase-specific. Male and female phase tend to be the same floral bouquet, but one species tends to be different from the other species in terms of composition and in terms of proportion of the compounds in the bouquet. So I love this research. It's just, it's kind of like a huge bubble of a lot of different things together. I am the one providing the phylogenetic component and the plants, and I have tons of collaborators providing their ideas about the floral sense, their ideas about the pollinators, their ideas about the biochemical compounds, and of course the ideas about the hybridization and the industry of the Anthurium as a whole. So for sure, I have to acknowledge my funding sources, which are the Missouri Botanical Garden, where I'm currently working, and the Living Earth Collaborative at the Washington University here in St. Louis, and my collaborators in Hawaii, especially Dr. Suzuki from the USDA in Hilo, his collaborators at the University of Hawaii in Hilo, and all his Anthurium growers, all those Anthurium growers in Hawaii that we were able to visit and talk to and figure out what's going on with Anthurium in Hawaii. And more locally, Emily Coletti, who is our greenhouse manager, she, like, I have a really black thumb. I cannot grow anything, but she keeps all my plants alive. And I will not be able to do this research without a huge collection that we have at the garden, thanks to her. So imagine 3,000 plants all under her care. That's an amazing task. And my collaborators in the floral sense, Corina and Florian from the University of Vienna, all our chemical analysis of the floral sense are being done in Vienna. So our samples from here, from Missouri, and future samples from Colombia and Panama will all go to across the pond, all the way to the University of Vienna. And I think that's it for now. I want to thank you so much for listening to my talk about my ideas of Anthuriums and this exciting new line of research that I'm pursuing now. And of course, to Marcus and Shruti for inviting me again. Next time it will be in person, and next time will be a lot more, because we will be able to finish all our questions and all our research.
I have a question. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. That was really interesting, and it was a fascinating story. That's a lot of great work to tease all that out. I was a little just questioning one thing about, like, ecological implications. You know, is there really good information known about which pollinators pollinate which species, and if these changes are done in the wild, could that, you know, maybe cause problems and we lose some pollinators that are really tightly adapted, because a lot of insects are very tightly adapted to even certain species. So can you comment on that?
Yes. So
Okay.
out of the 1,500 species of Anthuriums that we know so far, only 60 of them we know they're pollinators. So that's what, like 2% or something like that. It's like a very small amount. And it's basically because it takes a long time to be in the field and touch the pollinators when they're active. But for the ones that we know that there are two kinds of pollinators, like the general pollinators that kind of go to any Anthurium that is out there, and they just grab pollen and grab perfumes from all of them. And there are some species of insects that only go to a certain species of Anthurium. So definitely with climate change, that those interactions might be affected. With deforestation and losing the plants that the pollinators rely on, those interactions will be affected. So it's definitely like a race against the time, right? We're trying to understand everything that is happening at the same time that the forest is being cut down right behind us. And that has happened to us. Like we literally had bulldozers cutting the forest that we were collecting it. So we still have to do it, and it's still going to be a valuable thing, but we haven't figured out how can we stop it? No, like how can we stop these interactions from being lost? They're going to be lost. Which ones are the ones that we can actually save? We won't be able to save them in the greenhouses. In the greenhouses, we can save the plants, but these plants are not being reproduced, and they're not being pollinated. We don't have the pollinators up here.
Hold it.
You can go ahead. Yeah.
So Monica, so the commercial plants that don't smell, has the smell been bred out of them, or does the genetic background of them come from species that don't smell to begin with? Or what are the commercial ones? Are they complex hybrids or breeding, or what's going on to create these smellless plants?
So I don't think we know yet, but I have actually seen the parent, the initial berry parents of all the commercially available plants in the wild in Ecuador. It has the same nice color, but I wasn't able to smell it. Like, could be two things. I was not there at the right time, so it wasn't releasing the scent, or it actually doesn't smell. We don't know yet. We have to actually study that species in particular more. Like there is one background species that all the commercially available Anthuriums have. So, and we know which one it is. So we definitely have to study that one in more detail in the wild. It's easy to find. The other thing is maybe by trying to hybridize for defensive against pathogens and bacteria and all the stuff, some other traits were lost in the hybridization process, right? And this happened a long time ago. This happened about like hundreds of years ago. So we don't know exactly when along the pathway of crossing these smells, if they have them, if the original parents had them, got lost. So we have no idea, but we definitely know one of the parents, and we should definitely study that one more. Yeah, great idea, yes.
I have a question about customers. It seems that, in the meantime, before you develop these very fragrant Antheriums, that you could have a poster up showing the floral parts, and you could even dissect an inflorescence and show a customer, yes, this is real, this isn't plastic. You wouldn't have those details in a plastic inflorescence. So, if I were trying to sell these inflorescences, I think I'd try something else in the meantime. I don't know if anybody else is doing that, but it seems like you could convince some customers at least.
Yeah, so some customers are convinced that they're natural. I think it's like a new generation of customers that are not as familiar with Anthurium. Those are the ones that are having most problems. And it seems like bridal designers are the ones giving the most trouble. I have no idea what the background of a bridal designer is, but it's definitely not anything related to botany. So they might not understand flowers. Yeah. So one thing that they do notice is that when they start to wilt, so these flowers, they last a long time. They could last about 2 weeks without wilting. When they start to wilt, they get convinced. It's like, oh yeah, it's actually going bad. So that means it was a natural plant. It was not plastic. So that way they were convinced. But of course, when they're wilting, it's unusable for them. So it's kind of like, okay. Yeah.
Yes, I was just going to say that it seems like the florists where I live in Bethesda are sort of disappearing because the supermarkets are taking over the floral trade and things like that. But if I were a desperate florist, I might even spray some with Chanel No. 5 or something like that to get those things sold.
Yes, that could be definitely an option. Or just put it like in the water where because they are in water. So that's something else. I'm like, if you see them, they are in a bucket with water. Like you will not put plastic flowers in a bucket with water. That's just like common sense. But yeah, it's interesting how other people think.
If my budget were small, I might dabble vanilla on them or something like that.
Yes. So I'm looking at the chat really quick. Warren, you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I had another question. It just seems like, I don't mean to monopolize, but it just seems like, you know, with all the plants on the planet, maybe somebody needs to get really creative and push some other plants, maybe that are native to the area that have a good fragrance, you know, and you know, not have to spend so much time making a plant that doesn't smell and, you know, it just, it seems so like silly in a way, you know, to have to spend all this effort to make something it isn't.
Absolutely. I was amazed that in Hawaii, the natural flora is not as used as the introduced plants. Like heliconias are everywhere. They're introduced. They're not native to Hawaii. Anthuriums are everywhere. But like bananas and gingers, they're everywhere. And those are the ones that the people use and think they're native when they're not really native. Whereas they have this, like, they have really beautiful flowers that are native to Hawaii, and they just they get overlooked, right? It's just very interesting. Yeah. And Anthurium is taking over everywhere. Like the major producer of Anthuriums is actually in the Netherlands. Like there are no Anthuriums in over there at all. Like it's like, why are you even? Yeah, no. So, oh well.
There may be a similar thing happening with roses. It seems that they breed them, of course, to be more and more beautiful, perhaps to last longer. But I find that I'm constantly wanting, you know, I smell roses and bouquets, and they really don't seem to have the beautiful smells that roses had a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So it might go back to something along the breeding line that the scents get lost and nobody actually notices it until it's too late, basically. I'm like, okay, how do we recover the scent of the roses? And there have been a lot of studies done in scents of roses for sure.
Monica, I have a question. Nice talk, by the way. It's a very interesting topic. And my question is on the breeding system. Have anyone studied the breeding system? Because the flowers are so tiny. I don't know if they have done cross-pollinations or how to, you know, what's the degree of selfing these plants can tolerate, and if outcrossing maybe increase fruit sets and maybe the chances of having more fragrances or different type. Because pollinators seems to be generalists, like flies or these bees, and inflorescences are open. So it's easy to cross between coexisting species. So I wonder if there is any information on that, on hybridization, breeding system, and on that topic.
So in terms of hybridizations, we know that there are no naturally occurring hybrids in the wild. Like we have never found a hybrid in the wild. On the other hand, there are tons of hybrids man-made that people sell in their nurseries and their greenhouses. So we know it's possible, but something in nature is preventing it. What we think is the timing of the release of the pollen, the release of the scents, the attracting the pollinators. So that's in terms of hybridization. So hybridization is a very weird topic. We don't know too much about why it's not happening in the wild, but it's happening when I do it. The other thing that we know is that there is some degree of selfing. So in the greenhouses, we don't have anything pollinating them. And we still have certain species that set fruit all the time. It's like we have no idea how they're doing it. It's gotta be selfing, right? So we haven't done any experiments like bagging the inflorescence and not allowing anything at all to touch it and to figure out if they still set fruit. But I'm willing to say yes, for some species, that is very common, tolerated, and they do have seeds, and the seeds are viable even. Most of the species, though, they do rely on outcrossing. And they do not cross very well if they are distantly related in the phylogeny. Like, for example, we have a group of Central American species that are very closely together to each other in terms of evolution, and they cross with each other really well. They set fruit, they produce beautiful hybrids. When you try to cross the Central American group with the South American group of species, they do not cross at all. Every single cross that we have tried has failed, that have not set fruit and have not set seeds. So we do have some information, but there is still a lot that we need to know about the system in general, like the compatibility system, which there has to be some sort of incompatibility in some of them, and the selfing system, there is still a lot. Yeah. I need more students though, that's what I need. so I can give each one of them a little project and figure it all out.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
I have another comment. If a carrion beetle or some kind of beetle pollinator or a fly gave this talk, it might be the reverse, right? What's good and bad.
Yes.
So it's something you might consider in a future talk for laughs or whatever, or just to get people thinking more.
Yes, absolutely. Like this is all from a human perspective, and
Right.
even our noses. Like I go around with my team of interns, and we have 3 different people, and most of the time, 2 of us do not agree on what the smell that we're smelling is. Like even like individual differences. So we have to write down everything. Like, okay, you smell carrots, but I smell like lemon. It's like, those are 2 different things. Like our noses are smelling very different things. So yeah, definitely. And
I smell durian.
Oh yes, durian. Yes, exactly. That's another one. Some people smell it and some people don't. Or yeah. So yeah, it's definitely very, very different. And from the insect perspective, we haven't done anything. It is in my mind that I'm going to find an entomologist that actually have the little, it's like a electrical circuit that you can plug to the antenna of the insects and figure out how they reacted to the smells that we're feeding them. Oh, that would be like a super awesome tech that I should find somebody to do. Because for some of the insects, these flowery smells might not even be bothering them. No, like they might be like, whatever. No, that's not the one that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the poopy smelling one that is in very low concentration, but I can actually detect it. So yeah, definitely. And we have one species that nobody has been able to smell, but we still took samples of the space around the inflorescence when we thought it was receptive for male and receptive for female phase. So that would be a really interesting one to see if it actually has something, because to our noses, to our human noses, we could not detect anything. But who knows, maybe there is something in there that an insect can detect.
Well, there could be individual differences in how a particular insect of the same species, how different members of the same species smell, because in humans, of course, I'm astounded because I'm not a spring chicken, but I can smell odors that young people can't smell. I bring in flower like witch hazel, which blooms in the fall here, you know, the common witch hazel. I often, over the years, I've pointed it out and I tell them it smells nice to me. And they say, we can't smell a thing. So that is very surprising because to me, that's a very strong odor.
Yeah, we have in the building where I work, we have a grass. I believe it's called drop seed grass. We have to go by it every time. It's surrounding the entrance, and I cannot smell it at all. And I have visitors that have come by and they smell it and they think it stinks really bad. And it's just like, okay, we're smelling the same thing, and it's not the same for us. It's not the same for our receptors. I'm not sure how different insects are, but yeah, it will be interesting to figure it out. Ask an entomologist.
Well, actually, some Lasioglossum zephyrum, which is a sweat bee, and the males can tell different females apart by their bouquets, their smell bouquets. That's been something I worked on a long, long time ago. And other people have worked on that too. So it makes me think that maybe some of these insects within the same species would smell the same Anthurium differently, you know, and they might find it more attractive or less attractive, just depending on the individual bee or beetle or whatever. That could be tested.
Yeah, definitely. That's nice. Something that a long time ago I read or somebody told me was that also, like when the bees are collecting the perfumes from the flowers, if there is a perfume or a compound that they already have, they won't be interested in visiting this flower, even though they might visit it on another occasion when they haven't collected that specific compound yet. So even the visitation of the flower might differ depending on what they already have in their pockets, in their legs, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? So thank you so much again, Monica, for such an amazing talk and, you know, in a very unusual topic. Very has been very, you know, interesting to hear all about the floral fragrances and how they can be related to the evolution and how we can use that knowledge to improve commercial flowers. So thank you again. And
thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Great presentation.
Thank you.
our next talk